translator is still massive. I think when I sort of conceptualized it, we've got our data insights team who spend pretty much the whole day in the office, sat behind a computer screen. And then at the other, perhaps more applied end of the spectrum, you've got your S&C, physio, technical tactical coach out on the pitch, just player facing. And that sports scientist has got to be that person in between who can straddle both.
It comes down to two things that I think are really interesting. It's the individualization of information. So how do we help this individual? And we're going from essentially taking a bucket of athletes and saying, you guys are really similar for a multitude of reasons, the number of minutes you've played lately, your physiologic capabilities, to now let's have our own like self-contained carrying case instead of this big bucket. And how can we support this athlete and insulate them and grow them in their own little environment?
Yeah, I was working with some students recently and had to set them a task. And we gave them some dummy data, one season's worth of data for one player, and then a match set of data from. And they all produced these like beautiful reports and these graphs, and it was all amazing. And they kind of drew some conclusions, and the conclusions all varied. It was interesting, but the first question I asked them was, what was missing?
That's where my job comes in. My job as the high performance director has ultimately become, how do I break down barriers and build bridges for performance? And then all of a sudden we became something, I think, really positive, and we're able to speak to each other very frankly when we needed to, and then also say like, okay, I trust this person to get the job done, and here's how I'm going to support him from behind.
Where football experts from around the world share practical and updated knowledge with the FSI community.
Welcome to FSI Talks, where the best experts in the world come together to talk about football. My name's Jack Nayler, and I'm the head of first team sports science at Everton Football Club in the English Premier League. And I'm hosting this talk today, and I'm delighted to be joined by Garrison Draper, who is Director of Performance at Inter Miami FC in the MLS. Now, today we're going to talk about the role of the sports scientist in football. And I think there's loads to discuss around this role, because over the last 20 years, as sports scientists have become more and more involved in football clubs and become more and more mainstream roles, the different areas that they cover have also grown. And there's a lot of different, I guess, interpretations on what this role is. So that's what I'm looking forward to diving into today. So what I'll do is I'll introduce Garrison, say hi to him, and Garrison, I'll let you give you a bit more of an introduction to yourself and maybe a bit of your background as well, please.
Awesome. Well, first off, thank you so much for having me, and thank you, FSI, for inviting me here. I'm so excited. And Jack and I go way back to the master's degree days. So it's fun to catch up again, Jack.
Yeah, no, good.
Just a little bit about me, and I hope we spend a lot more time talking about the fun stuff than me. My name is Garrison Draper. I'm the high performance director at Inter Miami CF, which has been one of the most interesting roles in my career. I've been here for about 2 years, and about halfway through my first year, we were taken over by the GOAT and a few of his friends, and it's been such a wonderful experience and such an interesting way to look at sports science. Prior to my time at Inter Miami, I was at the Philadelphia Union, which is another MLS club, for about 9 seasons. And there, starting at the academy, we built up a really interesting club philosophy centered around development. Sort of throughout that time, I was also pursuing my educational side. So I did an undergraduate degree at a small university in northeastern Pennsylvania called East Stroudsburg University. I did my master's degree with Jack at a school in Australia called Edith Cowan University. And then I just recently completed my PhD at Teesside University, where I looked at the impacts of travel, of heat, of altitude on the actual in-game performances of athletes. So looking at both on field, how far do they run, how fast do they run, but also how do they respond to those in really practical ways, where we can start talking about it as practitioners who may not be able to take every single internal load metric and make a decision, but we have to sort of use what we have available to us. So it was a super applied project that I really love and I'm really passionate about.
All of those things, big challenges when you're working in MLS.
Yes, all of them every day. And sometimes you even have 2 or 3 of them in a weekend.
Yeah, we don't have quite the extremes of travel and temperature swings that I think you guys go through over here, but there's definitely loads of interesting stuff we can learn, and we do of course end up traveling all over the world for games at certain times of the year, so there's really kind of rich territory that for us. But I think what I wanted to dive into today is really, because it's something I've had to think about a bit over the last year or so, because we've been recruiting a couple of positions at the club and sort of putting job descriptions together and stuff like that, is to think about, what do you think is, in 2024, a sports scientist in football?
This is my hope and dream, is that every person inside of our performance department is a sports scientist of some kind. And it's a situation where we want everyone asking questions. And that's what science is asking questions of the environment around us. And so I want my physical therapists, I want my physios, I want my athletic trainers, strength and conditioning coaches. I want everyone asking questions and then going out and finding the information to support it. Now, where does our sports scientist fall in that? Because it's its own role, it's its own title. They're the person that's supporting these practitioners and ultimately probably handling, managing, and distributing the data that's collected, so the practitioners can do their jobs and interact with the athletes. And the way I like to talk about it in our department is, picture a house. And we have our walls sort of all the way around the athlete, where we have our sports medicine experts, we have our physical performance experts, we have nutritionists, we have psychologists who are all specialists, and they're sort of the player facing. It's where we put our pictures in our house. Everyone's looking at the walls. Our sports scientist is that foundation of the house, where they're helping people make data-driven decisions. They're supporting them from below and feeding them information that's really important for them as an expert, as a practitioner, to make those decisions. And so that's how I've really started to view this sports scientist role, as they're supporting the practitioner, they're supporting the expert in making decisions and utilizing their expertise to help the athlete. And always, and I think this is the most important part for sports scientist discussion, physio discussion, strength and conditioning coach discussion, is that athlete has to be in the middle, and the information has to be going to the athletes, has to be going to the practitioners, so they can make a decision there.
I think that's a really good point. I think when I think back to the start of my career, like 16 years ago, this sports science as a discipline was still relatively new. There definitely wasn't the plethora of different sources of data that we have nowadays. I think we had 5 GPS units. We could occasionally borrow some very expensive force plates from a university to do some testing, but nothing like a Nord board or a hip assessment, whether that's a groin bar or a Kanga tech, nothing like that really. So yeah, but I still saw our role as sports scientists as almost sitting between what the other disciplines that existed at the time that were predominant disciplines were medical, like your physical S&C, fitness staff, and then the coaches. And I felt like a sports science staff, we almost sat between and across those 3 pillars, a bit like you say. And I always saw it, our role, one of our main roles is acting as a translator between them.
Mm-hmm.
And helping to make sure that all of those people were on the same page and were speaking each other's language, or understood what each other was saying, and providing the evidence and the data to back that up. I think as things have grown, roles have diversified a bit, and now we're really fortunate at Everton to have a data insights department, and within that we've got a sports science data analyst whose background is as a more practical sports scientist in a football club. So now what it sort of made me question a little bit, where does the role of the sports scientist sit within our separate sports science department, if you like. So we've got a separate sports science department to our data insights team. So I think that role as a translator is still massive. I think when I sort of conceptualized it, we've got our data insights team who spend pretty much the whole day in the office, sat behind a computer screen. And then at the other, perhaps more applied end of the spectrum, you've got your S&C, physio, technical tactical coach out on the pitch, just player facing. And that sports scientist has got to be that person in between who can straddle both and provide some insight.
And even the location of that individual on a day-to-day basis is such an important discussion point. They become really the central focus of a training day, because the coaches are coming over asking, okay, are we in line with our periodization? There might be a rehab coach or a physio who's doing a rehab on the side, trying to figure out what have we done with this athlete. There's the discussion of how do we tie this in with the technical and tactical data. And that's coming into the sports scientists, because they're sort of sharing data. They may not be sharing the same analysis, but they're at least sharing information. And so even just where that person is standing on a day-to-day basis becomes a huge sort of driving force of what's their role and what's their impact on a daily basis.
Yeah, absolutely. I think they can become a really important hub for everyone. But I think there's also at the same time then there's got to be a humility to the person in that role, because they've got to be happy to support the staff that are supporting the players, and they've got to be happy to provide them with insights so that they can go and have the impact on the players. And so sometimes it's not always so might not be so directly player facing. But I think under sports science you also have a load of other roles or other skill sets, and as sports scientists we're probably quite generalists in our understanding, whether that's S&C, whether it's nutrition, whether it's biomechanics, psychology. You've probably got to have some coaching skills. The list goes on and on, because like you say, you're working across those different departments, and you've got to have an understanding and appreciation of what they're all doing. I think one of the really important skills, or I don't even know if it's a skill, but I feel like it's a mindset within our industry of the sports scientist or sports science students in clubs, is to be the people that are kind of thinking slightly differently, a bit more innovatively about performance. Quite often the people who are perhaps bringing in new technology. And I think that's probably from that, like you say, it's the scientific underpinning of research and development, and wanting to understand what's going on through the lens of experimentation. But so I wondered first of all, how you saw that and within the industry and the importance of that, and then secondly, if there's any areas of innovation that you see coming up on the horizon.
That's a really good one, and there's so many. What I've been most impressed with myself over the past, and not to age myself too much, but over the past, we'll call it 10 to 20 years to keep it broad, is just the incredible accuracy that's come from a lot of our technology. We've been using GPS now for 20 plus years, but now we're talking about, we're fighting over the number of hertz that we're utilizing to make a decision. And that's a really cool thing that we're at. And now we're finding new technologies to leverage, whether it be something that's really only been utilized in the military and in automated cars like LiDAR to track athletes, or if it's continuing on building on our GPS and our accelerometry, where we're placing it. I think there's a lot of cool innovations that are coming just in the tech space. But what I think I'm really most intrigued by and excited about on the innovation side is where we can go with it next. And for me, it comes down to two things that I think are really interesting. It's the individualization of information. So how do we help this individual? And we're going from essentially taking a bucket of athletes and saying, you guys are really similar for a multitude of reasons, the number of minutes you've played lately, your physiologic capabilities, to now let's have our own like self-contained carrying case instead of this big bucket. And how can we support this athlete and insulate them and grow them in their own little environment? The other piece that I think is really exciting in the innovation side is creating more context, connecting our physical data with the technical tactical data, making it really applied for the coaching staff, and also asking questions that the coaching staff wants to answer. When you mentioned translation, it was the first thing I went to, is like, yeah, we can hand a report and say this is how far the player ran, or this is how many sprints the player did. But the first question I always get from a soccer coach is, well, why? Why did he do 37 sprints today? What was the purpose? How many went into the attacking half? How many went into the defensive half? Like, is it a good thing that our center back is sprinting? I sort of like shrug and say, I don't know. That's not really my expertise. What do you think, coach? And it creates these awesome discussions, and it's something that I've spoken to with a lot of people, and it's our data isn't giving us answers anymore, which is the good thing. It's giving us more questions to ask. And the sports scientists and all of our performance department people, we're constantly asking these questions and looking for new ways to solve it. So I don't know if there's new tech that I'm really excited about. I think the growth and the development of all of our tech is really fun, but what I'm really excited about is what we can do with that tech next, which is again going into the individualization and the contextualization of that data.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. I think definitely in terms of tech, I think like you mentioned, I think it's the development of the tech is and this probably applies to any technology and any line of industry in the world, is that things are getting smaller, things are getting more powerful, and we're probably going to have greater ability to place technology on multiple parts of the athlete, or perhaps to gain better insight into various different places, whether that's within the boots they're wearing, various different joints on the body that we might be interested in, whatever else. But I think that just comes with that miniaturization. And then I think the kind of evolution of the way things have gone with, like you said, when we started off with GPS and having all these numbers and it just being kind of, there's been a process of learning what it all means. And now we're collecting that much data. We are finally getting better at managing it. And we've got organizations investing in proper management and organization of that data. Like I mentioned, we do at Everton. And then that is allowing us to then ask those better questions. I think context is absolutely key. Understanding, and one of the things I've been pushing, and I think where we are for understanding or having context, is the pace of life within a professional football team or soccer team. If you want to then go back and go compare like for like on a player with a time point, a similar time point, or a similar situation that happened earlier in the season, or you want to compare a couple of players across time, or whatever it may be, having that detail on the context is super important, because the pace of change that happens and you go from game to game, you might be different, but there's no way I can remember what happened, in training several weeks ago, let alone several months ago, because so much water has passed under the bridge since then. There's so many changing things. So the collection of detailed context is really important, and then how we can apply the data within that context. And then completely agree with you on the individualization piece. Something we're trying to push massively at the moment is how we can individualize better for our players, whether that's using our data, but also when we're actually training and how that impacts the players' training and what they're doing. Rather than it being, I think we're most places now pretty good at understanding collective training data, collective drill data and stuff like that, and planning drills and training and periodizing around groups of players. But how good are we at adapting that for individuals within sessions, or designing sessions for individual players? I don't know. I think, like you said, it's probably one of the next frontiers. Super interesting area. Go on.
Yeah, I need to give credit where credit's due, but Darcy Norman at US Soccer,
Yeah.
really pushed me over the past couple of years to think about it and how do we become better storytellers.
Yeah.
And that's essentially what we are. And sometimes the story doesn't need more data. It needs more background. And that's something that I've really been thinking about and talking about. And
I was working with some students recently and had to set them a task. And we gave them some dummy data, one season's worth of data for one player, and then a match set of data and they all produced these like beautiful reports and these graphs, and it was all amazing, and they kind of drew some conclusions, and the conclusions all varied. It was interesting, but the first question I asked them was, what was missing? What else would you have wanted to know from this data? And I think that's one of the biggest things that you learn. You don't necessarily learn at university, but you learn on the job, is that there's so much other context, like you say, and understanding of the game that you get from working in the environment.
100%. And one of my all-time favorite anecdotes sort of about that, when we were trying to figure out ways to make wellness surveys and RPE simpler for athletes. And so we built a couple apps. Ultimately, I think we ended up putting it into like the Facebook Messenger back when Facebook was cool. Now it's not as cool, and we got to find some new solutions.
TikTok.
But there was a big fight between a professional fight, of course. No punches thrown, I promise. But there was a big fight about, do we have a notes section at the end of our survey? And from an objective point of view, like, there was no point. Like, we just weren't sophisticated enough to collect that type of information and do anything with it. But we decided to keep it in. And a couple of years of data collection goes through, and what I found is I utilize the data to objectify it and make decisions sort of 10,000 foot view. But when I needed to make a snap decision, I went straight to the notes section. And the amount of information that just came from that quasi conversation was amazing. And it was like, you knew everything about the athlete. And it was really fun from the athlete's perspective for me, where I think sometimes they forgot that actual humans read it. Like, it was because they were just chatting with a bot, essentially. They would put information that they probably wouldn't have told me directly if I was sitting down in front of them. So I was finding out, oh, I got in a fight with my girlfriend. Oh, I stayed up all night hanging out with my girlfriend. And it was really great context that then I could go in and say, okay, this guy who had really poor sleep last night, is it a training related issue or is it a lifestyle related issue? Where do I need to point them? Which direction? And it became really, really important. That context sort of overtook the actual objective data, but obviously the objective data was just as important, just in a different way for us.
Yeah, absolutely. That's just reminded me you've just triggered me on a couple of things, which I'll just say one briefly, and then it's got sort of led me on to another question for you. But the first one was just around a piece of tech. We're talking about innovation, so a piece of tech that got proposed to me recently, utilizing AI, which is obviously a huge topic everywhere at the moment. That basically proposed that athletes would talk into their device, and then based on the way that they spoke, it would feed back what kind of state the athlete was in, obviously with some compared to baseline, how the change in tone of their voice as they spoke and things like that. The AI would apparently be able to tell you how fresh your athlete was feeling based off a conversation. But you're starting to get into that realm of, you need to be able to deal with athletes as well, and have conversations with them, and it can't just be all about the data. You mentioned just when you were talking there about a professional fight, and paper I read recently that was released around how the functioning of high performance teams in sports settings, and they did kind of study on a load of different high performance teams with surveys and things like that, and the results were really interesting. One of the things that stood out to me was that highly functioning high performance teams disagree openly, professionally, but they agree closely personally. So they have the space and the psychological safety to open up and disagree, but they keep it professional, and they know that they can disassociate the professional opinion from the personal. And I thought I'd just sort of lead me on to talking about how you in your role manage all the different parts of that high performance department. And maybe you could just elaborate on who's in that department for us, and how you go about trying to achieve some of that professional disagreement that we know can bear such great fruit.
Yeah. This is a loaded question, Jack. So I hope you're ready for quite an answer, 'cause I had to spend a lot of time thinking about it.
Yeah.
I've got to give a little bit of context, like we talked about, before I dive into it. So I joined Inter Miami in 2023, and there were always high aspirations for the club, but we weren't quite sure if they were going to come to fruition yet.
Mhm.
Halfway through the year, we signed three, I'd say, world-class players. And with that signing came a complete upskilling of the club. Along with those three players, we also changed coaching staffs and brought in a highly successful South American contingent of coaches. And so, with no offense at all, the way I describe that situation is we essentially took an alien ship and landed it on top of our club. And that's the coaching staff. It was a completely new culture. It was a completely new set of beliefs, a new way of periodization, all the way down to a completely new language. We went from being a primarily English-speaking club to I'd say 85 to 90% of my day is spent in Spanish. And so it was when we talk about cultural shifts inside of a professional soccer organization, like this was the epitome of it. This was not only a social cultural change, but also a performance cultural change, and also a personal cultural change. And so during that time, there was a lot of changes. And so the way our club is set up is we sort of have our club-based staff. We have a group of athletic trainers, physical therapists, sports scientists, strength and conditioning coach, myself as a high performance director. And with the original coaching staff, we were involved in every day's planning. We could talk about, oh, we need to get sprinting today, whatever it needed to be. We're all sort of in the meeting with the coaching staff. With this alien ship mentality, the coach brought in 2 fitness coaches that are on the field, and they're driving the on-field fitness. Now, my brain initially goes, okay, this is going to be a really big problem. This is going to be really hard. It was, but it wasn't for the personality clashes and the disagreements. It was because we had different philosophies on training. And as soon as we realized our goals were the exact same, it was, we want our players performing every single day at the top of their performance. And we were able to sort of connect on okay, here's what our strength and conditioning coach is really good at. Here's what our sports scientist is really good at. Here's what our athletic trainers are really good at. Here's what the head coaches, fitness coaches are really good at. And we were able to sort of differentiate and decide what's important. It became a really cohesive group. Now, do we argue? Yes, we argue constantly, because we all are focused on how do we help our athletes perform every single day. And so it's a really positive thing, but then you take a step back, you remove your ego, which is where Martin Buchheit's recent book really helped me in just saying, like, we've all got ego, but take 10 seconds, step away from it, and make a decision that's best for everyone. Take that step back, say what's best for the athlete right now, what makes the most sense, how does it fit into our philosophy, what resources do we need? And that's where my job comes in. My job as the high performance director has ultimately become, how do I break down barriers and build bridges for performance? And then all of a sudden we became something, I think, really positive, and we're able to speak to each other very frankly when we needed to, and then also say, like, okay, I trust this person to get the job done, and here's how I'm going to support him from behind, whether it be the fitness coach doing an on-field session and they're running and the players sort of flagging in a bad way. We can have the conversation of, like, hey, it's probably time to cut the losses. Maybe let's bring them into the treatment room and take care of them. The other really interesting part of that is when you're dealing with big time players, you're also going to start dealing with outside resources. They might have a physio they really like. They might have a nutritionist that they deal with, and they manage their day-to-day lives. Again, break down the ego, take a step back and say, what are these outside consultants' goals? It's to help the player perform. And so let's have the same communication I would with someone in my staff or in my club. Let's have the same conversation with the consultant. Ultimately, it's our job as a performance department to support these individuals. And if they like someone else or they want someone else involved in the decision-making process, let's bring them in and share the information, have a good conversation, disagree when we need to, but then also ultimately support the athlete. And that whole process has made me grow so much, and helped me rely on data a lot more when I need to make a point, especially when I'm doing it in multiple languages. But then also it's opened my eyes, my ears, my brain to there's 1,000 different ways to periodize soccer. And it's one of my new favorite things. Is like, I thought I had a philosophy on periodization. And since this group has come in, and granted, and I've told them this to their face, so I can say it on a podcast now. Some of the things they do is crazy. Like, I look at it and I'm just like, what's going on here? But it gets results. So open it up, understand what the meaning behind it, the intent is behind it, and then support it from below with whatever we need, whether it's extra recovery, strength and conditioning, new technology. Like, that was our role, and it became really fun.
Yeah, I think you make some excellent points there. I mean, I've worked with, I think, 9 different head coaches over the last 15, 16 years. And all of them have done things slightly differently, but all of them have been successful in their own ways, some of them hugely so. And all of them have done things that I would, with a pure sports science hat on, look at and go, that's crazy. But like you said, at the end of the day, we're here to support our players and our staff to perform at their absolute best and to help the team get results. And so one of the things I think we need to understand is the biggest stimulus the players are going to go through in the week outside of the game is the football training. It's not the gym session. It's not the 5-10 minute warm up at the beginning. It's not the 5-10 minute physical drill. It's the hour of football training they're going to do, maybe more, hour and a half, whatever day you're on during the week. And that's generally prescribed by the coaches. So how can we, coming back to that context point you mentioned earlier, and that ability to translate across departments, how can we help support the delivery of that in the best way possible? And I think it's such a super important part of the role in getting everyone on the same page and getting everyone working together, because one of the ways I always think about it now is that we work in a complex environment, and so that means that the performance is going to emerge from not from everyone doing their own thing to the best of their ability, but the interactions between everyone being really good. And so the better we can interact and collaborate and communicate and have structures in place to do that, the better. And so I think that kind of open communication, could be disagreement, discussion, is really important for one, understanding other people's opinions, because in a complex environment, you see what you see, but you don't see what everyone else is seeing necessarily. So you could learn stuff. And also, yeah, just coming up with some kind of collective decision making. And I think once we make a decision, hopefully we agree on the decision to a certain extent. Perhaps you feel there's some shortcomings, but everyone's on board.
Yeah.
And we move forward. And we've made that decision, we buy in. Because there's a couple of things I've seen from my experience over the years. When you start going, well, what those guys are doing is stupid, so I'm just going to double down on what I'm doing, you create more problems for the players, injuries, whatever. And yeah, you create more problems, and you cause more arguments. And the other thing is as well, like you mentioned, the external practitioners, when you sort of almost shut down, that's a really hot topic in football moment, and loads of people talking about it. But I think it's one of those things where Pandora's box has been opened. Like, players are more and more going to have their own support staff outside of the club. They are their own athletes now, and they're athletes 365 days of the year, and they want to pretty much. In fact, I haven't seen a situation where it's not come from a place of good motivation from a player wanting to be better. But we're not going to pull that back now. As in-house club staff, we're never going to pull that back. So you can approach that in two ways. You can either rage against it and stick your head in the sand, pretend it doesn't exist. But again, you're going to come back to that almost like mixed methodologies piece. Or you can, like you say, approach it by trying to open up a dialogue, have a conversation, and trying to reach the same goal, which we all want, which is that athlete performing to their best.
100%. And the one thing, and I hope there's athletes listening, and I'm sure there are, the one thing I wish I could change about the entire process is that I don't find out when something bad happens.
Yeah.
It always seems to come up after an injury or after a player performs really bad. He's like, oh, I was working with a fitness coach. And I'm still looking for the best solution to this. Ultimately, what I've started doing is, in our physical packet on the first day of the year, there's a sheet of paper that says, who do you want us talking to you about you?
Yeah.
Are we allowed to talk to your agent? Is there a physio? Is there a nutritionist that you want me as the high performance director or our athletic trainer or our physical therapist to talk to? And if there is, write their name down, write their phone number down, write their email down, and I'll call them today. And we'll have whatever conversations you want. And it captures more, because at least it's a starting point that we're open. But like my real goal in this entire process is to get to the point where the second a player arrives in the club, they're saying, okay, here's my physio, here's my nutritionist. I want you speaking with them. And that's like my ideal, and I can't wait for it. And I have to give a lot of props to him. But Jordi Alba, when he joined the club, was exactly that way, and I really respected it. He immediately shared his nutritionist's contact information, and this nutrition has become one of my favorite practitioners in the world. Like, sometimes I'm just texting with him, and it's not about Jordi. It's just about whatever we were thinking about in the performance world. And it's become an amazing relationship, to the point where he now has access to our club menus, and he can see exactly what's being served. He creates the entire thing for Jordi on his website. And sometimes he'll even be like, hey, I really want this in the menus for the week. Could you help me get this? And of course, because he's been such an awesome person to deal with, it's immediately like copy and paste what he wants into one of the menu slots, and there it is. And it's become a great relationship. But I'm looking forward to more of those in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. I think also what we're going to start seeing is people transitioning out of club roles into some of those more player supporting roles. And I think what we're certainly seeing in this country, those people that are doing that, they know what it's like being on the other side, being in our seats. And so they want to make it work. And they know that how to make it work. So hopefully that only improves. The last thing I really wanted to pick your brains on, and it's probably more of a selfish one from me, is you mentioned your PhD at the beginning, and interested in recovery, really, because of the challenges you guys face in terms of travel schedules and things like that. So I'm kind of interested in how you go about managing, whether you're monitoring and then adapting recovery schedules for the players, or just generally how you're going about doing recovery, because I think it's one of those areas where there isn't a magic bullet. We've got sleep and we've got nutrition as our big rocks, but there's a whole load of other little pieces to the puzzle that will tell us a little bit about recovery, and little adjuncts that players can be doing that have got some evidence, mixed evidence, good evidence, poor evidence for some things that are pretty trendy to do, that come and go. So just from your research and your applied experience, I kind of wanted to ask you about recovery, really.
Yeah, and travel related stuff, I think it's really interesting. And I have noticed on LinkedIn and Twitter lately, there's been a bit of a discussion around jet lag, and there's another symptomology that, to be completely honest, and this is the joy of working in sports science, is that we're always finding new information. There's another symptomology called travel fatigue, which I had never heard of until I started researching this. And then all of a sudden I'm reading about it and saying, that makes a lot more sense. Like for true jet lag to occur, you have to travel over 3 time zones. And my question to myself is, yes, we do that in the United States. But it's 1, maybe 2 games a year. It's not something that happens really frequently. I would assume in Aussie rules football, because they have 3 or 4 time zones, that they're doing something really similar. But again, it's you're going from Perth to maybe Melbourne, so there's probably only 2 or 3 teams that are on either side, or more on the western side. So jet lag is probably not something that us as practitioners have to deal with a ton. Obviously, we have to deal with it in World Cup situations, continental competitions, but it's a pretty rare thing. So focusing in on this travel fatigue concept is one that I think we as practitioners can do a better job of. It's selecting the right stressor, selecting the right challenge. And when we start looking at travel fatigue, there's some really specific symptomology, some really specific challenges that we deal with. So it's almost done. I'm hoping that maybe even by the time that this podcast goes out, we have a paper coming out hopefully coming out, still under review in IJSPP, regarding how travel impacts athletes at the MLS level, but at the elite North American level. And what we found is when we look at a single match, there's really not that big of an impact with travel. Points per game, goals scored, goals conceded, high speed running, total distance really doesn't change that much when we look at a single game of travel. So even when a team's traveling from the East Coast to the West Coast of the United States, there's not a huge impact. But when we start looking at it from an accumulation standpoint, so when over the course of the season, you're traveling more, you're flying more, you're away from home more, we start to see changes in performance. We start to see walking increase versus high speed running, and sprinting increase. We start to see more goals given up. And so there is sort of this like a cumulative challenge that we really need to think about. And unfortunately, there's not a lot we're going to be able to do to change how much travel accumulation we're really picking up. It's the way the schedule is going to fall. So then it's, what can we do to reduce the impact? And where I really personally think we can do better is routine maintenance. I think when we start changing players' routines before games, game days, we're creating more challenges for the athlete, and we're taking the focus off of the match. And so ensuring that we're giving them the right routine so they can sleep the way that we want them, ensuring that we're giving them the food that they need at the hotel, or wherever, so they can perform, I think has been our biggest focus. And it's a really interesting process, and I can't wait to dive into it more. But it's not so much like what's new and innovative that's come out. It's just like, no, like, we know a lot about nutrition now. We know a lot about sleep. We know they both impact performance at a really high level. So make sure the athletes can do it really well. And then as we start talking about international travel, because I was very fortunate with our club that I got to travel around the world this year. Literally in 14 days, we flew from Miami to Saudi Arabia to Hong Kong to Tokyo back to Miami. I think there were some things that really helped. And on the nutritional side, supplementation with omega-3s, electrolytes, utilizing caffeine. And we actually utilize a company called FlyKit that did a really nice job helping us plan that. I thought we had really good success. And I'll just talk about myself personally. That was the best I've ever felt flying, utilizing something like that and being very strategic with my supplementation and my timing. So there's little tricks, but I think honing in on making sure that athletes can do the things well and consistently is probably the most important in that process.
Yeah, I actually think in general, for performance, consistency is king. Just being consistent, whether that, like you say, whether that's around nutrition and sleep and things like that, but also just training. Players want to have a change in their body composition in some way. Whatever it is, just be consistent. Don't do it in fits and starts. The players who suddenly like, no, I need to be fitter, I'm going to go for this. No, train properly the whole time, and you'll be in a good spot. Don't do it in fits and starts.
Yeah.
Consistency, absolutely key. We are kind of running out of time a little bit, but one question I just thought I'd ask you at the end. I'm curious, like you said, we've known each other a few years, but I'm curious about, in coming from North America, the USA, what was your sport growing up? Was it soccer?
Yes, I was a soccer player, but the way I explain it, I was really good at the running part of soccer, which is why I became a sports scientist, because I get to deal with that data. I wasn't a great footballer, but then I became a marathon runner after the fact.
Yeah, I think there's a whole heap of us working in as sports scientists, S&C coaches, who are all kind of failed athletes at some point. Outside of football, what would be your favorite sport?
Oh, I'm a huge basketball fan. I love basketball, and I tend to like college basketball a little bit more. I like the underdog stories, but the NBA is really fun to watch. So if I'm not watching soccer, I'm watching basketball.
And who's your team?
Milwaukee Bucks.
Milwaukee Bucks.
Yeah.
Had a good few years.
What about you, Jack? Come on. What are some of your favorites outside of soccer?
Me, well, I see. I never grew. I didn't grow up playing football really, other than in England, everyone plays football with their mates in the park or at school at lunchtime or whatever else. But outside of that, in a formal setting, I played rugby. Rugby was my sport. So again, I similar to you, I was quite a good athlete, a better athlete than I was a better player. I think I had a good brain and understanding of the game, and I was good athletically. I just didn't have the skill set. That was my biggest downfall. But yeah, rugby was my sport, and still love it. Still watch it, and wished I could have played a bit more over the last few years when I've been working football games on Saturdays instead. But yeah.
Can I turn the mic on you before we finish off?
Yeah, absolutely.
So sort of everything we talked about. We talked about context. We talked about these professional fights and arguments. We talked about bringing in all this context, just thinking about it from a young practitioner who's looking about this, trying to upskill. What's the biggest thing for you when hiring someone or hiring a young practitioner is a skill set that you really wish they had or wish they were working on to be an elite sports scientist that maybe they haven't gained through schooling or they should focus on a little bit more while they're in schooling?
I think those things that we've spoken about, translation, context, they're all really, they stem from really, really strong soft skills. I think when, like I said, we've been through a couple of rounds of recruitment this year in our department in the club, and I think that X's and O's we can teach. There's the knowledge you can learn, and you absolutely will do that through your, whether you're at university or platforms like FSI and the lectures there. You'll get some great knowledge there. But the soft skills to be able to have conversations tactfully in what can be a very high pressured environment are really important. And I think a degree of empathy and understanding is huge, because I always think like the guys that we deal with are so high profile, they're dealing with things on a level that we can't contemplate at times. And so we have to try and have a degree of empathy and understanding around their situation, and perhaps sometimes what can be quite challenging behavior. One thing I always say, I've been fortunate to work a number of high profile clubs with some really, really high profile players, is that they exist in a different sphere to us. And so we're not going to be able to beat them down to our level and make them understand everything we want them to understand. We've got to be able to go to them and work within the way they work. And so I think those soft skills to be able to have empathetic conversation with a player or with a coach who's under a huge amount of pressure, who, let's face it, for most coaches now, they're either winning trophies or their jobs are on the line. But so the pressure around the coaches we work with, the players we work with, it's huge now. And so the ability to have those conversations in a tactful way and have some sway and influence over a situation, but also to know and understand and listen to what's coming back the other way is hugely important.
Well said. Couldn't agree more.
Perfect. Well, listen, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it. It's been good to catch up, and we should definitely do it more often.
Yes, we should.
And that just leaves me to say thanks for listening in and tuning in, and we will see you on the next episode of FSI Talks.
FSI Talks, where football experts from around the world share practical and updated knowledge with the FSI community.